to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to have secured this adjournment debate to mark International Human Rights Day, which we remember annually across the world on the 10th of December. I should first, of course, declare an interest as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group, whose purpose is, and I quote, to raise the profile of international human rights issues within Parliament and to investigate and publicise human rights abuses occurring. The group is one of Parliament's most long-standing APPGs, set up in 1976 by the late human rights champion Lord Avebury, and one of the most active, with at least one event a month, and often many more than that. I should also declare an interest in what I'm about to say, because I'm chair of the British group of the Interparliamentary Union. Madam Deputy Speaker, last week, the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group held a reception, organised jointly with Amnesty International UK, to mark Human Rights Day. It was very well attended, showing that the protection of human rights across the world is an issue which transcends party politics and matters greatly to many of my parliamentary colleagues right across the political spectrum. International Human Rights Day commemorates the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly on this day in 1948. The Universal Declaration, whose 75th anniversary the APPG celebrated last year in Parliament, is founded on the principle that, and I quote, all human beings are born free and equal. And it set the standards by which states must treat their citizens and provides the basis on which governments can be called out and held to account for not doing so. The Universal Declaration has had a profound impact since, having inspired and paved the way for the adoption of more than 60 human rights treaties at global and regional levels, and having provided the basis for the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. At the individual and collective level, the Declaration has protected millions and empowered many to stand up against abuse and tyranny and for equality and justice. Yes, of course, I will give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first of all commend the Honourable Gentleman for Leeds North East. In all the time that I've been in this House, short time, the Honourable Member, Right Honourable Member, has been here longer than I have. I've always been impressed by his commitment to human rights issues, standing up, speaking, and he and I, in every debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, would have been there together, and I want to commend him for that and put it on the Hansard for that reason. Does the Right Honourable Member not agree that this is a day not simply to view how far we have to go, but also to celebrate how far we have come, and that the biblical verses, I should say, never grow weary of doing good, for in due season you will reap as you diligently sow. Those lovely words from the Holy Bible that the Honourable Member and I both respect must encourage us all to keep pressing and keep winning the small human rights victories that literally save lives, grant education and preserve innocence for children. Thank you.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, the member for Strangford, firstly for his generosity, but secondly because he is an extraordinary performer in this House, not just on these green benches, but in Westminster Hall, where I've sat around the table with him on many, many debates, and where he always stands up for humanity and for faith. And I respect and thank him for that, and I agree with his quote from the Holy Bible. I thank him for making that quote. Madam Deputy Speaker, at the individual and collective level, the Declaration, as the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford has said, has protected millions and empowered many to stand up against abuse and tyranny and for equality and justice. And for this year's commemoration, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is focusing on the realisation of rights as a pathway to solutions for many real-world challenges, such as armed conflict, political and social exclusion, and economic equality. And goodness me, don't we need that in the world right now. Let me highlight one of the key provisions of the Declaration, the right to life, which is of course fundamental to the enjoyment of every other right that we're there to protect. Categorical violations to the right to life include, of course, extrajudicial killing, the misuse of the death penalty, indeed I would argue the use of it at all, life-threatening prison conditions. We've seen that very reality in the footage from Syria in recent hours and days. The use of live ammunition by police forces against unarmed protesters. Serious violations of humanitarian law and environmental degradation and climate change, which give rise to serious threats against the existence of present and future generations. Madam Deputy Speaker, tragically, the right to life is violated in many countries by state and non-state actors, such as in, for example, China, North Korea, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Colombia, and Mexico, to name just a few, I'm sorry to say. And in this context, I'd like to express the APPG's deep concern about the killing of human rights defenders, brave people from all walks of life, community leaders, environmental activists, lawyers, journalists, trade unionists, academics and members of NGOs who are committed to promoting and protecting the human rights of their communities in their countries and the wider world. The APPG has been privileged to meet many inspiring human rights defenders over the years. Their work, seeking to document violations, hold human rights violators to account, and tackle cycles of impunity, may result in serious threats, including harassment, smear campaigns, physical attacks, arbitrary detention, torture, and in the worst cases, murder. Environmental and land rights defenders are at particular risk, with NGO Global Witness estimating that in 2023, 196 land and environmental defenders were killed around the world, with the highest number by far in Colombia, followed by Brazil, Mexico, Honduras, and Nicaragua. During my time as Shadow Minister for Latin America, I visited Colombia and met with trade unionists and human rights defenders who were facing violent attacks every single day. And 2 weeks ago, I met with the Wiwa indigenous peoples representatives of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta from northern Colombia to hear their testimony firsthand here in our Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, I will give way. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much thank my honourable friend for securing this debate on this very important day. And he's absolutely right to draw attention particularly to the experiences of defenders of Indigenous and communities and environmental rights defenders, particularly in Colombia and elsewhere. And I draw the House's attention to my role as a Vice Chair of the All-Party Group on Human Rights, in which capacity back in October I hosted a roundtable here in Parliament with speakers from the Colombia Caravana, which brings together, I think it was lawyers from 24 countries who'd recently conducted a fact-finding trip in Colombia. And they highlighted the increasing power of illegal armed groups, particularly in areas with no or limited state presence, and the serious threat these groups pose to rights defenders. And we heard really powerful testimony from the leader of an Indigenous Peoples Reserve speaking about the threats that his community was under. He called for the UK government to do everything possible to ensure that UK companies are held to account for the impact of their actions. Would my honourable friend support that call from that Indigenous Reserve leader? Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I also thank her for her work as an officer of the APPG and for chairing that meeting, which I was slightly late for, but did attend most of it. And I did hear those testimonies firsthand, and of course I would support that call. I think it's very important that we recognise the extraordinary brave and courageous work of people like those individuals who were there that day, like the human rights defenders we heard very recently from Peru, and like the individuals that I mentioned from the Wiwa peoples of Colombia. All over the world, human rights defenders are putting their lives, their safety and their freedom at risk to defend their lands, to defend their rights against rapacious companies that are exploiting them because nobody will protect them except themselves. So I thank her for her support and all the work that she's doing too. With President Gustavo Petro, we've got renewed hope in Colombia. But sadly, the attacks continue. And as the pen holder for Colombia at the UN, I'd be grateful if the Minister could this evening reaffirm our commitment to what the Colombians called paz total, total peace in Colombia. Indigenous peoples continue to be disproportionately targeted, as I've already said, accounting for 49% of total murders. The UK and like-minded countries must help support and protect human rights defenders. To this end, I understand that the UK's 2019 Support for Human Rights Defenders guidance is being renewed, and I'd be interested to know if the Minister has an update on when we may expect this review to be published. Given the crucial role that human rights defenders play in fostering peace, justice and inclusive development, I'd ask the FCDO to continue elevating the guidance to a more comprehensive strategy with benchmarks for officials and for posts which could then be adapted to specific country situations. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot speak about the importance of the Universal Declaration without also highlighting another of its central provisions, and that is equality. Article 2 states that, and I quote, "Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status," end quote. I believe that all parliamentarians are horrified by the treatment of women and girls in some parts of this world, particularly in Afghanistan. Yes, of course, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and congratulations on an excellent speech and for securing a debate on such an important day. And he very rightly draws or identifies Afghanistan and the issues around discrimination of women and girls in this great country. Does he believe that that the UK might consider joining the action of, I think it's 30 international countries in the International Court of Justice action, which has concerns around the breaches in CEDAW?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and yes, I'd be interested to hear from our Minister as to whether we should join that action, because in some way or another, we really need to draw the world's attention more clearly and in a more focused way to the shocking and appalling and totally unjustifiable treatment of women and girls in Afghanistan and indeed in other parts of the world. Because until the genders, the sexes in this world are equal, we will not have, I believe, the peace, justice and development that all of humanity so deserves. Madam Deputy Speaker, under this government, we rightly have a relentless focus on tackling violence against women and girls in our own country. But this should really extend, as I've said, across the world. It's simply incomprehensible, and I stress this again, that in the 21st century, the Taliban can completely silence Afghan women and girls, by almost erasing their very existence, barring them from education and public life. Extremely courageous women who protest against these violations face the most terrifying consequences, including enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention and torture. And just today I heard an example of how this works on the ground in Afghanistan. I was told by somebody who knows that country well, who isn't an Afghan, that they were recently speaking to Afghan doctors and midwives about the problems that many Afghan women are experiencing, especially in remote rural areas, giving birth, with birth complications leading to all sorts of other horrors, including the mortality, the death of their babies at birth. And the Taliban have allowed women, under a special exception, to work as doctors and midwives, thank goodness. But the problem with this is that if a midwife or doctor, female midwife or doctor, is stopped, as he put it, by a bearded man, walking to work from where they live. They're stopped and questioned and sometimes returned home. And because women and girls can no longer have the training and the education necessary to make and create more gynecologists, obstetricians, specialists, doctors, clinicians and midwives, there is a time bomb ticking, amongst other things, in this particular area in Afghanistan, at this particular field of work. It is extremely disturbing. As I've said, extremely courageous women who protest against these violations face the most terrifying consequences, even if they're doing it with permission and legitimately, including enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention and torture. Our APPG is also worried about democratic backsliding globally, with the consequent erosion of political and civil rights, such as freedom of expression, assembly and association. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index in 2023, less than 8% of the world's population lived in a full, proper democracy, while almost 40% lived under authoritarian rule, a share that's been creeping up in recent years. And I don't need to remind honourable and right honourable members that this is happening, because we're all aware of it. Every single day we hear stories about the way parliaments and parliamentary democracy is under attack. Electoral autocracies are becoming more prevalent, with sham elections held in an attempt, largely unsuccessfully, to provide a veneer of political legitimacy. I'm not going to name countries, but we all know where they are. The increase in violent conflict, as we've seen in Russia and the Middle East, has also stifled progress towards more meaningful political participation. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it would be helpful to know more about how this government and our government will continue to help promote and support democracy in the world and closer to home, whether the Defending Democracy Task Force still has a role to play in protecting the democratic integrity of the UK from threats of foreign interference. Yes, I'll give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and I really appreciate him bringing this matter to the House today. I think it's incumbent on all of us to ensure that we do everything we can to stand up for human rights, whether it's at home or abroad, and indeed that issue of standing up for democracy, not just in terms of the world that we're actually physically living in, but online, is of a real concern to me and many across this House. And would he agree with me that actually we need to do everything we can to ensure that elections, not just here but across the world, and the tenets of democracy are protected, as we struggle to deal with someone who would love to erode those fundamental freedoms and human rights that we hold dear?
I thank the Honourable Member for such an important intervention, and I would certainly agree that online interference is something we should be deeply concerned about. Indeed, we are deeply concerned about it, and we've seen examples of that interference, that hacking, those bots, as they call them, creating posts which are for non-existent individuals on our social media, urging people to do something or to vote in a particular way, quoting sham facts and figures which don't exist, that are made up, that are invented, in order to persuade people to make a decision which would be against their interests or against their inclinations. So, in connection with the latter, I note a growing worry about transnational repression, when authoritarian governments reach across their borders to silence dissent amongst diaspora communities and exiles, including through illegal deportation, abduction, digital threats, attacks and family intimidation. Indeed, we've heard examples through the BBC World Service in recent years of their correspondents in London having families intimidated or even arrested, harassed by the authorities in Iran. People who've got nothing whatever to do with the work that their family members are doing here in London, but nonetheless paying the price for that freedom to broadcast, that freedom of information, and the brilliant work that the BBC World Service does. The UK, of course, as I've just said, has not been immune either, and I'm pleased that our government has recognised that. Individuals living here who've left Russia, Hong Kong, China, or indeed, as I've quoted, Iran, have been subject to surveillance, attacks, confiscation of their properties and bank accounts in their countries of origin, and even assassination and attempted assassination. UK parliamentarians too have been targeted as well. with foreign governments having imposed sanctions against them for calling out human rights violations. This is something that will need to be more effectively addressed, I believe. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this House in finding out that all my assets and bank accounts in Russia, which I have none whatsoever, have been confiscated or closed down. And I know that in recent years, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the last Parliament were refused visas to go to China because of what the committee had said about Hong Kong and Taiwan. This is simply unacceptable, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we do need to address it. Now, as I said earlier, I'm current chair of the British group of the Interparliamentary Union, and I'd like to commend the human rights work of the IPU, particularly that of its Committee on the Human Rights of Parliamentarians, not one I chair, the international one, that is doing such a lot of work to defend the rights of parliamentarians. Because the committee seeks to defend them under attack. Every single year, MPs around the world face abuse, mistreatment, disappearance, and death sometimes. The Human Rights APPG and BG IPU work hand in hand in the belief that parliamentarians' voices must be protected and allowed to be heard, free from fear of violence or harassment. Parliamentarians are often so-called canaries in the coal mine. If the human rights of parliamentarians are being violated, the situation of those in that country who do not have wider popular backing or the high profile of a local MP is likely to be far, far worse. So I'd therefore like to urge my friend the Minister to make clear that this government will put human rights and peace building at the forefront of our foreign policy once again. And this includes, I believe, a relentless focus on securing the release of arbitrarily detained nationals like Nazanin Zaharie Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashouri. Anousheh spoke extremely powerfully and beautifully at last week's event about his imprisonment in Iran, and I'm pleased to call him a friend. He's a delightful man, and I'm amazed that after the ordeal that he went through, he's still able to campaign in the open and democratic way that he has. He really is a remarkable man. I'd like also to call to focus on gaining more support for the victims of gender-based violence, conflict and modern-day slavery, and for encouraging support for the International Court and the importance of international law. More specifically, Madam Deputy Speaker, parliamentarians must have a key role in, for example, ensuring governments' compliance with their human rights obligations and holding those governments to account for any violations, for incorporating human rights protections in national legislation, for helping to generate the necessary political will to bring about positive change domestically and internationally, and, of course, engaging with, supporting and validating civil society, human rights defenders and intergovernmental and grassroots human rights organisations. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to all members of this House and the other place for their work on these issues, whether it's on select committees, with all-party parliamentary groups, or in their individual engagement with human rights organisations and defenders. And I think this might be the moment to pay tribute to my dear friend who died earlier this year, Tony Lloyd, from whom I took over the responsibility of chairing this committee. He was a spokesperson from his first election in 1983 through his time as Minister of State at the Foreign Office in Tony Blair's government of 1997 for human rights and for the prominence and importance of human rights worldwide. And not long before he died, he spoke to a friend of mine and said, in the event of my death, I would like to see Fabian Hamilton taking over this role. And I found that deeply moving. And so I do this not just in the name of all those who are oppressed, whose human rights are not easy or clear, whose human rights are taken away from them, but in the name of Tony Lloyd to carry on the work that he did. Governments, of course, have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring their citizens benefit from their rights and for promoting respect for human rights internationally. And I know that this government takes that responsibility seriously. Having worked closely with the Foreign Secretary and his excellent team for several years, I can say with utmost certainty that this government is committed to protecting the rule of law and international rules-based order on which our security and prosperity rest. I therefore welcome the government's unflinching approach in calling out serious and systematic human rights violations committed by state and non-state actors, and when appropriate, the imposition of sanctions. I believe that it would be beneficial for the government to consider bringing in legislation on mandatory human rights and environmental corporate due diligence. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate could not come at a more appropriate time. Democracy and freedoms hang by a thread across the world. In Putin's Russia, we've forced conscriptions for illegal war in Ukraine. We've seen that. The Iranian regime is clamping down on legitimate protests with the most brutal force. And in China, China continues to lurch towards interference in our democracy and has all but destroyed any semblance of it in Hong Kong, and indeed wishes to attack the democracy that is now evident in Taiwan. Finally, members of the all-party Parliamentary Human Rights Group and I hope to continue engaging on these issues with the FCDO, and I'm looking forward to the Minister's response on this 76th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I say how appropriate it is for you to be chairing this debate, as you've been such a champion for women since you came into this House, chairing the Women and Equalities Committee. And that theme has come up again and again from members this afternoon. And I'm so grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North East, for securing this debate and for the day on which he has secured it, which of course is Human Rights Day. And we've just had a lovely occasion with Mr. Speaker where we have celebrated Parliamentarians for Peace, coordinated by the member for Saddleworth and Oldham, and who of course has made an intervention in this speech and in this debate, and which I will attempt to answer as I go forward. I would like firstly to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Leeds North East for his tireless work to promote the importance of international human rights, including as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Human Rights, and also to congratulate him on his recent election as chair of the British Group of the Interparliamentary Union, standing up for democracy, free from fear of violence, for every country. And that is the magic of the IPU, that it does bring together members across so many different countries with their different versions of democracy, but all straining for that. I was very struck by the member for Lagan Valley when she talked about the importance of online safety and democracy. And I'm sure she's aware of now taking her seat in this House and how the erosion of our own rights as members who've been brought here on the wind of democracy being attacked online, and how disgraceful that is. And we must seek new ways and fresh ways of tackling online abuse. I also appreciate the contributions of other honourable members, particularly the member for Suffolk, who talked about the issues in Colombia, the indigenous groups and the illegal armed groups. And of course, she mentions this because we are aware that human rights defenders put their lives at risk to defend their land and tradition. And we're also aware from other members who share her interest, for example, the member for Leeds North East, who of course have gone to Colombia, got to know what the concerns are there, and have brought them back to this House. And of all of the countries in Latin America, the work that the UK government does there on human rights, going right back to before the peace process, then supporting Colombia as it brought in its peace process, and still monitoring that with its new government. This is the work that started in this House and which continues to be a support to support that important work. And of course, the Honourable Member for Leeds North East has also mentioned those who have gone before us, Lord Avebury, and of course the Member for Rochdale, who I got to know at a similar time. Well, perhaps I didn't know him quite as well as the Member for Leeds North East, but he did such a fantastic job of supporting the women of Belarus, who of course didn't start out as being politicians or human rights defenders, but whose husbands were locked up in the summer of 2022, and of course they had nothing to do except to become public figures in their own right, once again attacked online, attacked for all that they have done to stand up for their country. And as honourable members are aware, today marks Human Rights Days, commemorating the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And of course, my honourable friend is aware and was invited to the celebration in the Foreign Office this afternoon to mark International Human Rights Day, which we all would have liked to have been at. However, we're doing this debate instead, so we are celebrating it in our own way. But the team, who I must commend for their excellence, have been putting on a really important event to listen to those who work with human rights defenders, non-governmental organisations, human rights defenders and others who care passionately about human rights. And of course, the member for Strangford, who's no longer in his place, but he has tried to celebrate how far we've come. Today is a celebration of how far we've come, and the UK's very important role in that. But it is also a reminder to us that we must keep pushing forward, because if human rights have not been achieved yet. And we know from the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, who talked about the women in Afghanistan, that we continue to call for the human rights of all Afghans to be protected, including those of women and girls and religious and ethnic minorities. We know that officials at the Doha-based UK mission to Afghanistan regularly press the Taliban on human rights, but we are still making very limited progress, and we must continue to speak out in this House so that if there is any online coverage in Afghanistan today for Human Rights Day, those women will know that we're talking about them and that their education, whether they want to become midwives and nurses, which is currently being blocked by the Taliban, whether they want to become teachers or work or have the small businesses, instead we are seeing a terrible deterioration of women's rights. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that is a particular concern that you hold dear. As the Prime Minister set out in his speech to the UN General Assembly this year, the Declaration sets out the very essence of what it is to be human, of equal and inalienable rights, based on a foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. As one of the original drafters, the UK must continue championing its importance and building upon its foundation, given the challenges we face today. The Government will act to protect and promote human rights, democracy and the rule of law around the world. But, of course.
I thank the Minister for giving way. She's making a very powerful speech that I think highlights the importance that we all have, both individually and collectively, in the protection of human rights, both in the UK and around the world. And earlier today, I was with Councillor Amjad Wazir from Stoke-on-Trent and a group of Kashmiris who are presenting a petition to Downing Street to highlight the ongoing abuses of human rights in Kashmir, the lack of the right of self-determination and the continuing violations of the suspension of Article 370 of the Kashmiri of the Indian Constitution, guaranteeing the political autonomous of Kashmir and Jammu. Could I ask the Minister, because all too often Kashmir seems to be forgotten about and it's not talked about in this place nearly enough, so could I ask what the Government's current view is towards the ongoing issues in Jammu and Kashmir, and could she potentially take back to her department the opportunity for us to discuss it fully in this House, because it's been a while since those people were given a voice here and I think they would welcome it.
I thank the member for Stoke-on-Trent for his important point and also for the work that he is doing to represent his constituents and indeed going to Downing Street with a petition. And interestingly, the other person who's very strong on Kashmir, of course, is the member for Leeds North East, who regularly brings groups of constituents into the House, as do other members of the House. And I know that the cross-party work that is done to promote human rights, observing the importance of human rights in Kashmir is so crucial, and that situation is monitored by the Foreign Office, but I'd be very happy to write to him in more detail as to the exact way in which that is monitored, bearing in mind, of course, that India and Pakistan play that a crucial role in maintaining the peace.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for her kind words earlier. I would like to add to that in terms of the issues around human rights defenders who we know have been detained without trial in many cases. Karam Pervez is just one example. And also politicians, political activists. Yazin Malik, again, we're very concerned about his condition. But I don't think it's appropriate today of all days if we don't mention the situation in the Middle East, particularly given the Syria and Israel, Palestine and Lebanon. And but hope the Minister will be able to respond to those points in her closing remarks.
Minister.
I thank her for her point on Yassine Malik, and that is one of the situations which the Foreign Office actively monitors, as she is aware, because she's a regular correspondent with the Foreign Office on that point and a very active member of the all-party group. But could I say on the Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories that, of course, we are monitoring the humanitarian response there, but I think the Syria situation, we all knew intellectually how terrible it was, but to see those prisons opened with the most unspeakable conditions has been truly devastating to see. The nooses with human blood on them on the front page of our newspapers, to understand that people have been buried 6 foot under in cells, women and children in prison in that way in Syria. And we don't know what the future of Syria is. It's a very fragile situation, but what we do know is that this House on Human Rights Day has emphasised the importance of human rights being at the heart of the Middle East on several different fronts as these different situations develop, that human rights must play that key role in any peace process, and that key role in Syria in the way that it is governed in the future. The first theme that I'd like to talk about, and there's a couple, I will shorten my speech a little, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I know people are keen to get on to human rights events this evening and to International Parliamentary Union events as well. We're very keen to maximise the impact of all the tools at our disposal, and of course our approach sees the agenda in terms of 5 themes, which I will quickly outline. The first is on defending civic space and fundamental freedoms, and today 1/3 of the world's population lives in countries with a closed civic space, which is clearly unacceptable. And we will do that by changing our fundamental relationship to enable grassroots actors in partner countries to advocate for people's rights, protect media freedom, building on the call for Commonwealth leaders last month to implement the Commonwealth media principles across our diverse family of nations, which I refer the member for Lagan Valley to. As my honourable friend set out so clearly, the government must continue to promote and support democracy in this world, and we're doing so through the Defending Democracy Task Force. The task force is an enduring function of government which seeks to secure the democratic integrity of the UK from the full range of threats, including foreign interference. It comprises ministers, operational leaders and senior officials, and brings together His Majesty government work on defending democracy to ensure we have a whole-of-government response to the threats we face. The task force is currently reviewing the UK's response to transnational repression, so elegantly laid out in my honourable friend's speech. And with his permission, I would like to write back once that review is finished so that it can marry up with his earlier request that we look in an organised and systematic way at how we organise our work on human rights across not just the Foreign Office but across government. And with his permission, once that review into the task force, the work of the task force, bringing together the transnational repression, once that's complete, that we will write to him and to all the members of his APPG so that he can get a sense of where we're going with this important work. We must have a robust and joined-up response across government and law enforcement, not only to the human rights agenda, but also specifically to transnational repression, which he so eloquently set out in his speech. And he was right to highlight his concerns about the killing of human rights defenders. They do inspiring work, often putting themselves in harm's way, and we heard from the Honourable Lady from Suffolk about the human rights defenders and peace builders in Colombia who put their lives at risk to speak out. I can confirm that our human rights defender guidance is being reviewed, and we expect this to be finalised and published in the new year. We certainly take account of the wise recommendations in this debate about what a review should cover and the examples used. Meanwhile, we continue to work with partners to address the shocking level of reprisals against human rights defenders, including women. Our second theme focuses on upholding the rule of law. My honourable friend mentioned the critical right to life violations, such as the misuse of the death penalty and the use of excessive force against unarmed protesters. We need to promote and demonstrate respect for the rule of law in addressing these and many other issues. We have levers within the multilateral system to promote and defend human rights, including at the United Nations and through regional bodies like the Council of Europe and the OSCE, and my honourable friend makes particular mention of attacks against rights defenders in Colombia, which we covered earlier in my reply. I'm delighted that we have a renewed parliamentary delegation to the Council of Europe, including a number of honourable members to this House, and I look forward to their reporting back to the House and bringing these matters to the attention of the House. I'm also glad to share that we're seeking election for another term on the Human Rights Council from 2026 to 2028, where the UK leads negotiations on resolutions which put in place accountability mechanisms for priority countries around the world, including Syria and Sudan. In Syria, as I've said, Assad, with the support from Russia and Iran, has committed brutal atrocities. So our focus now is on working with the Syrian people and the international community towards moving quickly to an inclusive political transition. We're committed to tackling impunity and supporting an effective and independent international criminal court as the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious crimes of international concern. Promoting compliance with international humanitarian law is the cornerstone of UK policy, and we call on all parties to conflicts to implement their obligations, reducing impact on civilians and other non-combatants. This autumn we published an updated voluntary report on our domestic implementation of international humanitarian law, and we're supporting other states to do the same. And as you'll have heard ministerial colleagues say in this House on other occasions, we're clear about the unacceptable humanitarian situation in Gaza, a matter that so many in this House have championed. We will continue to use all the diplomatic tools at our disposal to work with international partners to bring about a ceasefire and secure the release of hostages. Madam Deputy Speaker, accountability is not just about international processes, and that's why we work in partnership with the USA and with the EU to ensure that Ukraine can fully and fairly investigate allegations of war crimes in its own judicial system. We have our best legal minds working on this. And in other places, like Nigeria, where we're advising on dealing with vulnerable witnesses such as children and survivors of sexual violence, our legal diplomacy is second to none. Our third theme out of 5 focuses on championing equal rights for all, and I've already spoken about the Taliban's disgraceful exclusion of women from all aspects of public life. We want to address the stalled progress and rollback on the rights of women, girls, LGBT+ people and those belonging to other marginalised groups globally. And that's why we will continue to champion the rights and freedoms of women and girls, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, and indeed women's rights organisations, and challenging harmful disinformation. And we will support the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, working with women parliamentarians globally to address barriers to their political empowerment. We have announced a groundbreaking global programme to prevent technology-facilitated gender-based harassment and abuse, backed by over £27 million of funding, and I hope that the member for Lagan Valley will be pleased with that development. This will pilot innovative work with partner countries to promote a safer online experience, counter extreme misogyny spread online, and support victims and survivors of online harassment and abuse. And finally, we will defend the rights of people belonging to marginalised communities, for instance by funding the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum to advocate for disability rights, and by championing freedom of religion or belief for all. And if the member for Strangford were in his place, he'd be pleased to hear me say, we are fighting back against the threats so many face for simply what they do or do not believe in. The fourth theme, moving now to the fourth theme, is supporting accountable, effective, inclusive institutions. And sadly, we are seeing international drop in the quality of institutional life. We want to work with partners to protect democratic processes and strengthen government legitimacy, for example, in Moldova. We've helped President Sandu's government counter Russian disinformation through the UK government's Communication Service International. In Brazil, we're sharing UK expertise as the government develops its own online safety bill. In Nigeria, we're supporting Kaduna State to improve budget transparency. And in Nepal, we're continuing long-term work with the country, supporting the transition from conflict to democracy. Our final theme, Madam Deputy Speaker, is responding to shared global challenges by prioritising human rights and governance principles. And I think this debate has added a lot of challenge to the Department to get this right. We're living in a rapidly changing world which demands that we adapt to it, but we must do that while maintaining our principles. And we are taking multiple steps to do that effectively. We're conducting a national assessment of our approach to tackling business-related human rights abuses, including in global supply chains, ensuring that our actions are firmly based on evidence of what works and what does not. We are actively engaging at the Council of Europe to address impact of climate and nature emergencies on human rights, and we are hosting the second Democracy Action Partnership with Indonesia in Jakarta to support democratic resilience in the region. And we're working with partners such as the UK-based Centre for Information Resilience to remotely verify and document digital content relating to horrific violence in Sudan. Madam Deputy Speaker, the 5 themes I've laid out lay a strong foundation for defending and promoting human rights around the world, and I hope that my honourable friend will agree from what I have said today, and indeed from the FCDO's earlier event, which sadly we both missed, to mark Human Rights Day, that the government does indeed see human rights and peace building at the heart of our work. We recognise the many members of this House that share this commitment, and I thank them for being in the House today. Ultimately, a freer, safer and more just world is in everyone's interests, and this government will work flat out with its partners to achieve that goal.
Yeah. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.